Hello there folks, I'm Dan Brown from sortofinteresting.com and today you're joining me on board good old Narrowboat Abel's Ark for part 2 of my completely free audiobook series. This is a book that I worked on throughout 2018, all about my return to life on a narrowboat after living on dry land for 2 years, called The Call of the Canal. I hope that you'll enjoy what you're about to hear today. Episode 1 is also completely freely available here on YouTube as an audiobook, which you can go and find on the channel page. Please do check that out if you haven't already. And well, in today's episode, we're going to take a look at my first couple of days on board, and then in a future episode, we'll be looking at getting the boat back into the marina and really getting stuck into the odd jobs on board and making this boat a proper home. So I hope what you'll find today is entertaining and amusing. I'll get plenty of boaty footage up on the screen instead of having a look at this thing going on here. So I suppose I better do some selling out before I leave you to enjoy the video, as I won't be doing an outro. It'll just be the audiobook and then it'll be just fade off into black and you can continue your day. So, as many of you know, obviously by releasing this freely as written posts over on the website and also obviously as this audiobook collection here on YouTube, I'm missing out on a load of potential book sales. So I did set up a Patreon to support this, as book sales have traditionally been what's funded and held up this channel and basically kept all this madness rolling on. So if you're curious, then please do consider checking out the Patreon in the links below. But it's absolutely optional. This audiobook is completely freely available to everybody. If you don't support the Patreon, then I hope you enjoy this book just as much as anybody else who does. And I don't hide anything behind the paywall or anything like that. It's purely optional, which I wanted to make sure that was very clearly stated in this video. And well, please do check that out if you'd like to. And thank you very much to those of you who have already been very generous and gone over there and supported it. So thank you very much. Also, before we get stuck into the audiobook, I should just say the usual things, that if you also want another way to support this and help me out, please consider checking out my short books about life on my previous narrowboat Tilly. You can find them for the Kindle. You've got the paperback collection, which is just there in the background somewhere on the shelf there. And yeah, you'll find links to those in the description as well below. And of course, please feel free to add me on Facebook and Twitter and all of that sort of thing. You'll find loads of links in the description to the Patreon, my short books, and of course, all of the random social media links that you seem almost obligated to have if you have a YouTube channel these days. Anyway, my friends, I hope you enjoy what you're about to listen to. Hope you enjoy the boat trip that you're about to see on the screen. And well, until the next time, my friends, have an absolutely fantastic day. Keep it book-worthy, keep it boat-worthy, and of course, my friends, farewell. The Call of the Canal, Part 2, by Daniel Mark Brown. Chapter 4, Moving Out and Settling In. The day after I had signed the paperwork for Abel's Ark and transferred the money over to the marina, I revisited the boat, as I would almost every day until the paperwork had been finalised. It would take 7 days for the keys to be officially handed over to me on April the 27th. However, by that time I had already moved some of my furniture on board, began painting test patches of different shades and finishes on the walls. Whilst back on dry land, I started attempting to offload some of the possessions which would not be joining me afloat. When I use the term I in this transition period, I really mean to say we, as my family and friends played a huge role in helping shift furniture around, taking things to and from the boat, wandering around Oswestry Industrial Estate looking for inspiration and ideas for simple small storage and furnishings, along with the many other tasks that somehow appear suddenly in the brief period between not owning a boat and then owning a boat. It was a fantastic week. A bonus bit of fun was thrown in as it was also my birthday during that time, so a lot of pizza was consumed to mark the occasion before getting back to work. Before long, the boat had been thoroughly cleaned from top to bottom. The few bits of furniture on board had been removed and taken to a charity shop, and I had a rough grasp on how all the systems on board operated. With great difficulty, I managed to pick a favourite between the almost identical magnolia paint colours for the interior walls. It did become apparent after a brief test patch that it may take a surprisingly long time and several coats to get such a small area as the boat walls painted, but that would be a job for me and my granddad to tackle later on. More than anything else though, in those early days of tinkering in the marina, I was most keen to go from merely a boat owner to a boat dweller. Regardless of how well the boat was coming along, and despite having a minimal amount of furniture and barely any trinkets, ornaments or decorations, I was surprised that when it came time to sell, give away or bin my land life possessions, there seemed to be an awful lot to do. I had started this process even before actually buying the boat, as I wanted to be in a good place for a calm transition back to boat life. However, it seemed to become a mad rush to get it all done as soon as possible when the ink dried on the boat contract. I listed a lot of furniture for sale on Facebook, as one of the key issues that I faced was that there would be almost no room for any of my furniture on board, so everything apart from my small sofa and one desk was up for grabs. I will admit that the selling process was infuriating. People would message after the items had clearly sold, other people would make an offer and not follow up with an actual sale, or in fact any further communication at all. And often the people who did buy would turn up hours later than agreed. The important thing that I had to keep in mind was that every single item that left my possession was another thing that I would never have to worry about again. As my storage items were sold off, I found mountains of paperwork that I had acquired over the 2 years or so of land life. I was shocked just how much junk I had held on to just because I had the space to put it in a drawer and forget about it. Whereas in my days on Narrowboat Tilly, most of it would have long since been ash that had gone up the chimney. All in all, I knew I was making progress and everything went about as smoothly as I could have hoped on leaving my home of 2 years in Oswestry. There was, however, one almost outright distressing part of leaving land life: destroying and selling off the model railway layout that I had been working on for the previous 7 months. During this time I had spent hundreds of hours and pounds on building scenery, industrial structures, adding details and flora and fauna to the trackside, as well as multiple failed attempts to build a tunnel area. I had really taken to the hobby, and on realising that my layout was actually longer than the width of the boat, I slowed my work down on the project, as I knew it would have to be sold off and destroyed. I managed to recoup some of the money I had spent through the sales, but the time, care and painstaking hours were all lost forever. Rolling up the final unsaleable sections of the layout to put in the bin was certainly a moment in which the fact that I was returning to boat life suddenly became very real. Chapter 5. I live on a boat. Again. Only 9 days after signing the contract, I would officially move on board Abel's Ark and once again become a boater. On the morning of April the 29th, my family would join me in the last big trip to the marina. In a small convoy, including a transit van and a Honda Jazz, we arrived at the marina in Ellesmere to take the boat out onto the canal for the first time, where I would then spend my first night on board my new home. However, on arriving, the first job that we had to do between the four of us was remove the last pieces of furniture from the previous owner, which then made room for my small amount but very awkwardly sized furniture to be brought on board. After the boat was cleared, we proceeded to quite literally wedge my full-size double mattress through the tiny back door on the stern. This required us to first completely disassemble the pram hood cover from over the deck area. Once that had been done, we had to bend and force the mattress through the door frame, which was a good deal smaller than the mattress itself. For any onlookers in the marina, it would have likely been a scene reminiscent of a Laurel and Hardy film, but even more chaotic as there were twice the number of participants. Once the bed had gone in through the rear, we needed to take my small sofa inside through the bow doors on the front of the boat. This meant moving the boat from the jetty that it was currently on and mooring with the bow facing towards the jetty just a few spaces up so that we could actually get the sofa to the front of the boat without hanging it directly over the canal water. This epic trip of less than 100 feet would be the first time I would take control of Abel's Ark. I will simply say that after 2 years away from boating and being far more familiar with controlling a much smaller boat, there were a number of scrapes, a small collision with the dry dock, and a very relieved Dan Brown when the ropes were once again tied up. The sofa went in through the front doors without any of the hassle that the mattress had caused, which was a great relief, as there were a couple of us that definitely needed a sit down. After taking a few moments to admire our handiwork, and then load up the transit van we had on site to take away the last of the furniture that had been on board, I wasted no time in getting us out of the marina and going boating on the canal for the first time in 2 years. This was one of the shortest yet most intense boat trips that I have ever been a part of. Firstly, I had to take the boat out of the marina, avoiding a great number of very smart looking boats, taking great care to not scratch the paintwork on the way past. Even by my very slow boating standard, we travelled at an almost literal snail's pace to the marina exit. Compared to narrowboat Tilly, which was much smaller, lighter and nimble to respond to the tiller, Abel's Ark felt like controlling a tank. She was much steadier in the water than Tilly, with a greater momentum once she was moving, but far less agile and slower to respond to my very nervous and overly frantic movements of the tiller. Once we had made it onto the canal, I breathed a sigh of relief as our anything but epic voyage was now underway, with clear waters ahead of us. We turned right on leaving the marina, passed beneath the road bridge nearby, which led us to the Ellesmere Basin area, which is effectively a very open stretch of water that also acts as a T-junction and turning point. If we travelled directly ahead, we would arrive at a dead end / turning point next to a supermarket. Instead, we turned left and passed by the Ellesmere Services and rubbish disposal point. By now, we had been boating for upward of 5 minutes. Already, the end of this monumental adventure was within sight. We continued beyond the services for a few hundred feet before bringing the boat to the side of the canal and mooring up. This may sound like an anticlimax to my first proper boat trip, but there was a very sentimental reason that I specifically wanted to moor at that location. After tying the ropes, Abel's Ark was quite literally moored on the same part of the canal that I had first moored narrowboat Tilly on, getting her back to where I considered home almost 6 years earlier. It was the same few feet of canal that many of my friends and family had first set foot on the boat all those years ago, and during the time that I spent on Tilly, I had moored there for at least a week or so every year. To be able to spend my first night on board my new floating home almost as if I had never left the canals was something that hugely appealed to my overly nostalgic mind. with the excitement of returning to the canals in general, I really do feel as if that mooring was the icing on the cake and final bookmark to an incredibly busy and stressful 9 days since signing the contract. I felt as if my 2 year absence had ultimately come to an end and that I was finally home again, both in terms of being on board the boat and where the boat itself was located. After having my passengers on board for the trip, we took another moment to rest and reflect on the situation. I was a boater again, this time with a bigger, better, and more comfortable boat to live on too. It was a fantastic feeling. Soon enough, though, reality resumed, and my mum and her partner left to return to Oswestry with a van full of bits and bobs and furniture for charity. Meanwhile, my granddad and myself remained on board to make some progress with repainting the internal walls, starting with the bedroom. As eager as we were when we started the job, with freshly bought paintbrushes and sheets covering every surface possible, we had already seen from the test patches of paint, for some reason it just did not want to go on evenly or smoothly, but at this point we were still underestimating just how surprisingly fiddly the job would get once we reached the living room. Barely any time seemed to pass as we painted and chatted away happily until something unexpectedly happened. As I walked down towards the front of the boat, I saw a sight on the towpath that made me point and splutter some kind of shocked exclamation, such as, What? Look at that! At first, this alarmed my grandad, until he too was looking out at the curious figure walking down the towpath towards the boat. A peacock! The large bird, complete with brilliant blue colouring and huge multicoloured tail feathers, was simply strolling down the towpath as if he owned the place. It is very rare to see a bird like this just wandering around in the countryside. In fact, I had never seen one outside of a tourist attraction until this point, and it seems as if he had simply broken free from somewhere one day and decided to travel the canals in his early retirement. We looked on with amazement as the bird literally walked up to the bedroom window and peered in at us, almost making us feel as if we were the ones who were out of place. He had a good full-length inspection of the boat before moving along and continuing with his day. A fascinating little incident to mark the start of my new boat life and to go down as one of the first great memories of life afloat on Abel's Ark. At length, after a lot of painting and plotting of which jobs to do on board and when, my grandad also left the boat, leaving me on board on my own to see in the evening and then sleep on board for the first time in my new home. It was a strange feeling, completely and utterly familiar, as I had already slept for over 1,000 nights on a boat at this point. Many of those nights had been spent in this exact spot too. At the same time, it felt incredibly different to life on Tilly. The boat had an amazing level of comfort and homeliness that I had not experienced on Tilly, a fact that helped me feel far more relaxed on board, despite having an awful lot to think about and for my naturally worrisome mind to dwell on. As the afternoon passed into the evening, I decided that it would only be right that my first meal on board should be one of junk food, which in years gone by had made up an embarrassingly large portion of my diet during my previous boat life. I went to a local chippy and returned to the boat with a large portion of chips and a generous portion of curry sauce to dip them in. I sat in front of the burning fire listening to my beloved audiobooks that act as a backing track to a huge amount of my waking hours, eating chips and curry sauce. On board a boat once more, I was just about as happy as I have ever been in my life during that moment. As the evening wore on, the sun started to set on the towpath side of the boat. This meant that as I peered through the windows that were overlooking the canal and the fields and trees on the far bank, I was treated to one of my favourite sights. The golden light of sunset illuminating the natural surroundings and giving them an entirely different look and feel to any other time of day. As the sun slipped lower toward the horizon and the light took on an extra hint of red, I quite literally stopped whatever it was that I was doing to simply watch the familiar view through the window go through the phases of sunset. Of course, I also had to go out and walk around the outside of the boat and onto the roof just to make the most of it. And because I was still excited and looking for any excuse to potter around on board. Later, after the sunset had well and truly turned to night, the moon rose up on the opposite side of the boat to which the sun had set, meaning that my previous golden view of nature was now a dark, silhouetted vision of the world, with a gleaming bright white moon steadily moving upwards and reflecting unsteadily off the disturbed water's surface. It was a truly beautiful moment, and a night that I hope to keep in my memory for a long time to come. When I decided it was time to go to bed for the first time on board, I threw a little fuel into the fire and walked down the few feet of corridor to the bedroom. As I lay there, my eyes adjusting to the darkness, I realised that I could see the dancing yellow-orange light of the flames of the fire reflecting off the bottom wall of the bedroom. I leaned over the side of the bed and looked down towards the living room. Seeing the fire dancing away as the only source of light on board was just about as homely and reassuring a sight as I could have hoped to have as my final sight of the day. Chapter 6. The Next Day. Waking up the following morning, I felt as if I had finally had a decent night's sleep. The previous weeks of nerves, decision-making and general worry had all played on my mind during the evenings, but this time I had gone to sleep knowing it was all behind me. Opening my eyes to a bedroom brightly lit by the sunlight streaming in through the blinds was a very good start to the day, but before long I would have a few more things to worry about. As I set about busying myself on board, I thought I would let the engine run for a while to charge up the batteries. This seemed like a nice simple everyday boat life thing to do. However, a short while later I heard a beeping sound coming from the engine at the back of the boat. In a panic I ran out onto the stern deck and switched the engine off. The beeping continued. It was actually coming from inside the boat. As I entered the boat and looked around for the source of the noise, I was horrified to see the living room filling with a blue-black smoke and a strong smell of burning plastic. When I saw the cause of this, I really did panic. On the kitchen wall, the inverter, the device that takes power from the batteries and turns it into usable power for plug sockets, etc., was beeping like crazy, a sound which, as I got closer, was joined by the sound of fans whirring frantically inside. It had overheated, and the fans at this point were only helping to blow acrid chemical smoke around the room faster. I switched it off at the wall, and then, fearing that it might turn into an outright fire on board, I ran around wildly looking for a screwdriver in case I had to unscrew it from the wall and throw it off the boat in a fireball. Luckily I didn't have to, but once it had all calmed down, it was clear that it had burnt out. So only a few hours into my first full day of boat life, I had already lost my inverter, and with it, all the use of my wall sockets. Once I had calmed down and resumed whatever pottering I was doing on board, I came to use a tap and found that the water pump then started to run for a couple of seconds here or there every few minutes, regardless of whether the taps were running or not. At first this worried me that there might be a leak and there could be water building up beneath the floorboards. But it soon became apparent what the issue was. My grandad arrived during the morning to resume efforts in painting the interior, but just as we had begun, the water pump kicked in properly, as if it was pumping water through a tap. I looked around in a bit of a panic, but couldn't see any sign of any water in the kitchen or bathroom until suddenly a big rush of water poured out of the cupboard beneath the bathroom sink all over the floor. One of the pipes going to the bathroom taps had completely come apart at a joint, so as soon as the pipe popped off, the water pump acted as if a tap was being turned on, and with the batteries turned up from running the engine, it had plenty of power to push as much water out onto the floor as possible. I remember giving a shout and diving across my bed to get past my grandad, who was painting the wall, to turn the pump off at the main wall switch at the front of the boat. The dust sheets we had put down to protect the floor and furniture from paint soon became towels to mop up the water. We diagnosed the problem and wedged some wooden blocks beneath the pipe to hold it in place temporarily. As you can probably imagine, that slowed our productivity a little, and when my grandad left in the afternoon, we felt as if the painting was becoming a bigger job the more that we progressed. I had a short time on my own to tidy the place up after painting, then run down the towpath to the shop to buy a few supplies, as I had a very special visitor coming around in the early evening. My little sister, aged 5, also accompanied by my dad, of course. I had decided it would be a fun idea to keep the boat a secret from my sister, so that when they came to visit, it would be a complete surprise. She had always loved Narrowboat Tilly, and even gave her some hand-picked flowers and said goodbye to her just before I sold her. So I hoped that her unexpectedly finding me on a new boat would be a pleasant little memory for all of us. My dad messaged me once they had started walking down the towpath, and as they got closer I could see my sister happily running around and looking at the boats, trying to sound out the letters in the names so she could read them aloud. Then she got level with Abel's Ark, and I stood peering through the window right at her. And she was so distracted by trying to read the name that she didn't see me. A moment or two passed, and then I caught her eye. "Daddy, Dan's on this boat," she shouted, before the look on her face showed that it was becoming apparent that this was my new home. What followed were some of the most pleasant hours that I have ever spent on the canal. The sun was shining, it was a really warm evening, and the canal was looking as beautifully rural as it gets. We decided to take the boat down to the nearest turning point, and then to come back up and moor at the same place, just facing in a different direction. It was only a short trip, but it was the longest boat trip I had done on board so far. The mixture of the amazing weather, family, and scenery really did make it something special. I have some great clear memories of my sister running up and down the boat, climbing on the furniture so she could look out through the windows, and generally having the time of her life. I also have memories which are just as clear of what would be the first of many failed turning attempts. There's no need to dwell on moments like this, which make me appear to know very little about what I am doing when at the tiller of a boat, but suffice to say, the front of the boat was a little muddier than when we had set out. As we returned to the same place that we had set out from, mooring was an easier task than it had been when I was still a bit panicky the previous day. We continued to have a fun time on board before my guests had to leave, as bedtime was fast approaching. For my sister, not my dad. So it was that I was once again left on board to see the evening pass into night, while I settled down for another very welcome great night's sleep. 2 days in, and Narrowboat life was already going very well.